had no idea how far the nearest house was in that direction, but I knew it had to be miles away. The dense woods around us felt like they went on forever. It was a typical late afternoon, with the sun lazily sinking behind the tall pines, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. My brother, Ethan, and my cousins Ryan and Liam had come up with a brilliant idea during lunch. The grown-ups were talking about hunting trips and past adventures, and before long, the topic shifted to camping in the woods for the night. As soon as they mentioned it, a spark ignited in us. We wanted in. It started innocently enough. Ethan, always the instigator, pitched the idea. "We should camp out in the woods tonight," he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. My cousins instantly agreed, their faces lighting up like Christmas morning. I wasn't sure what had gotten into them, but I wasn't going to let them have all the fun. I nodded, joining in. "Let's do it," I said, barely able to contain my own excitement. Our dads, who had been drinking a little, didn't take much convincing. In fact, they were more than eager to go along with the plan. Uncle Kevin, my dad's brother, was the first to speak up. "Well, why not? We were planning to go hunting anyway, and the woods are a perfect spot for it. Besides, it'll be a good bonding experience for the boys." He slapped my dad on the back, and they both laughed, the sound deep and boisterous, echoing through the kitchen. Our moms, on the other hand, weren't exactly thrilled. They exchanged worried glances, the kind of glance that mothers give when they know something's going to go wrong but can't quite stop it. But they didn't outright say no. They sighed and rolled their eyes, probably imagining us getting lost or, worse, something worse happening in the middle of the night. "Just make sure you boys are back before it gets too dark," my mom said, giving me a stern look, but her words were more of a formality than an actual restriction. She wasn't happy, but she knew it was no use. The decision had already been made, and the drinks in the air only made our dads more determined. Later that afternoon, after a few more rounds of beers and a couple of hurried preparations, my dad and Uncle Kevin took the four of us into the woods, along with a tent that looked far too small for all of us. My sister and our girl cousins stayed behind at the house, which, in hindsight, was probably a good thing. This was strictly a boys-only adventure. The walk into the woods felt like something out of a dream. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the woods themselves felt endless, as if we were stepping into a place that was both ancient and untouched. The only sounds we heard were the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustle in the trees above. As we ventured deeper into the forest, Liam, the youngest of us at only 10 years old, began to complain. He was already dragging his feet, his face scrunched up in annoyance. "How much farther is it?" he whined, kicking at a rock that lay in his path. "I'm tired. Can't we just set up camp here?" That was enough to get our dads laughing even harder. Their laughter rang through the trees, loud and carefree, as they exchanged teasing glances. They were in their element, away from the stresses of life, with a drink in their hand and their sons at their side. "We're barely even started, Liam," my dad teased, slapping him gently on the back. "You'll survive." Liam rolled his eyes, but he couldn't help but smile at the sight of his father and uncle enjoying themselves. The teasing continued for a while, with Ryan joining in to make fun of him, and even I couldn't resist getting in a joke. But something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were venturing too far. The deeper we went, the more the woods closed in around us, the trees pressing in from all sides. There was a strange hush in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We pushed on, ignoring the subtle unease that crept up on us. Eventually, we found a clearing, a small flat area where we decided to set up camp. Our dad started working on the tent, and Liam, though still complaining, reluctantly helped with setting up the small campfire. It was only then, with the fire crackling and the light of the setting sun dimming behind us, that I started to feel it. Something cold, something that wasn't just the crisp night air. A feeling of being watched. I glanced around the woods, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and dark. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking just out of sight, hidden behind the thick branches. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to look like a scared kid in front of my cousins. They'd never let me live it down. As the night grew darker, the silence in the woods became more pronounced. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed to fade away, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle in the trees. A chill ran down my spine. My dad, noticing my discomfort, came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice low, almost soothing. "Yeah, just a little cold," I lied, trying to hide the unease in my voice. But the truth was, it wasn't the cold that made me uneasy. There was something else out there, something that was watching us. I could feel it, and I wasn't the only one. As the fire flickered, I saw Ethan glance nervously at the woods, his eyes darting between the shadows. Ryan shifted uncomfortably on the log next to me, his expression unreadable. And Liam was too young to notice anything unusual, but even he seemed to sense the change in the air. We all sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of the night. But those sounds didn't bring comfort anymore. They were different, faint, distant, like something was creeping toward us. And that's when I realized this was no longer an innocent camping trip. Something was coming. At the time, I was the oldest of the group, 14, still a kid but with just enough experience to think I could handle whatever came my way. Ethan and Ryan were 11, and little Liam, the youngest, was only 10. It was funny how we all looked up to the older ones, even though we were so close in age. But that's how it always is, isn't it? The older sibling or cousin always gets the leadership role by default. We crossed beyond the property line, the boundary between the familiar world of the house and the unknown that lay deep within the woods. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. The further we walked, the darker the trees seemed to grow, as if we were stepping into a different world altogether. Soon we came to a small clearing. The sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy above, casting everything in a cool, shadowy light. The ground was covered in soft moss that Uncle Kevin casually called deer beds. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but he seemed convinced it was perfect for camping. "Used it before," he said, his voice slurred with the last remnants of alcohol. "You'll sleep like a baby." The way he said it, like it was no big deal, made me think he had spent a lot of time in these woods. Maybe too much. But at the moment, I wasn't thinking too much about it. All I cared about was the adventure, and I was determined to enjoy it. Our dads, half drunk but still functional, took charge of the tent setup. I could see how their drunken state slowed them down, but they were trying to act like they had everything under control. It was a comedy show, really. Uncle Kevin fumbled with the poles of the tent while my dad tried to read the instructions, but the paper kept slipping out of his hands. "You hold this side, and I'll do the rest," my dad barked, handing me a pole. They both looked at us kids with an air of, "This is your chance to prove yourself," so we jumped in. I could see that Ethan and Ryan were getting frustrated with the instructions. Liam, on the other hand, was just happy to be included. His tiny hands tugged at the ropes, his face scrunching up in concentration, though I could tell he didn't really understand what he was doing. As we fumbled with the tent, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of fabric and poles, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, animals scurrying in the underbrush, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. "Hey, anyone else notice that?" I whispered to Ethan. He was standing next to me, trying to hammer a stake into the ground, but his brow furrowed when he heard my question. "What?" he asked, pausing to look around. "It's too quiet." "There's no sound at all," I said, my voice low. He looked at me, a flicker of unease in his eyes, but he shook his head. "Probably just us being too far out. It's fine." I wasn't so sure, but I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to seem like a scared kid, not in front of Ethan and the others. After what seemed like hours, we finally got the tent set up, though it wasn't as perfect as the one Uncle Kevin had probably imagined. The floor was uneven, and the walls sagged in spots, but it would have to do. Once it was standing, we threw our sleeping bags inside. Felt like a small victory. The tent was big enough for all four of us, but it felt cramped with the heat of our bodies and the energy of the day still buzzing in the air. "We're set," my dad said with a satisfied grin, brushing his hands off as if he'd just conquered the woods. He grabbed a can of beer from his backpack and cracked it open with a loud pop. Uncle Kevin followed suit, and before long they were laughing again, joking about how great the weekend was going to be. But I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't explain. Still, the fun side of me kicked in, and I shoved the feeling aside. This was supposed to be an adventure, right? We all tossed our bags inside, made sure the tent was secure, and then we decided to head back to the house. The idea of dinner and a bit of relaxation seemed like the perfect way to cap off the first part of our day. We trekked back through the woods, the distance seeming shorter now that the excitement was building in our chests. The afternoon was spent outside, running around the yard, playing games, and laughing like we didn't have a care in the world. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the landscape, and for a brief moment, everything felt right. No worries, no strange feeling in the air, just us living in the moment. But as the evening wore on and the shadows lengthened, I couldn't shake the thought that the woods weren't as innocent as they seemed. There was something hidden in those trees, something watching us. After dinner, as the last light of day disappeared, we gathered around the fire pit outside. The flames crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks up into the night sky. It was then that I noticed Liam was getting a little too quiet. He was staring off into the distance, his eyes wide and fixed on the dark trees. He was clutching his sleeping bag to his chest like it was some sort of comfort, but it seemed like he wasn't comfortable at all. I was about to ask him what was wrong when I noticed something else. The woods were silent again, that same eerie quiet from earlier. It wasn't just the usual night sounds that had disappeared. There was an odd stillness in the air, like the woods themselves were waiting, watching, and then, in the distance I heard it, the faint sound, something rustling like leaves being moved, but it wasn't the wind. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time that day, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something was out there, and it wasn't just a wild animal. Dinner came and went in a blur of laughter, teasing, and the smell of grilled meat lingering in the air. But even amidst the fun, I could feel the unease creeping back. Our moms had tried once again to express their concerns. It was like a broken record, one that was stuck on repeat. "You boys are too young to be out in the woods alone at night," my mom said, her voice tight with worry, her eyes flicking nervously between my dad and Uncle Kevin. "You don't know what could happen out there. Anything could go wrong, and there's no one around for miles." I could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a mix of helplessness and resignation, as if she knew this wasn't a fight she could win. My dad, already a few beers in, leaned back in his chair, chuckling at her words. "Come on, Karen. They'll be fine. We'll be right here, close enough to hear Em scream if anything goes wrong." He laughed, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. His words, meant to reassure, felt more like a bad joke. I could see my mom's lips pressed together into a thin line, but she didn't say anything else. Uncle Kevin, equally tipsy, chimed in. "What's the worst that can happen? A couple of wild animals? These boys can handle themselves." He slapped Ethan on the back with a grin that looked a little too wide, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Ethan, always eager to impress, nodded enthusiastically, though I could tell even he was starting to feel a bit uneasy. Ryan, sitting across from me, shifted nervously in his seat, his eyes darting to the window. The setting sun had already sunk below the horizon, and the growing darkness outside seemed to deepen with each passing minute. The house felt safe, warm, and full of light, but the woods beyond felt like a different world entirely. It was an unsettling thought, how something could be so close, yet so far away. The woods, that thick blanket of trees, now seemed like a place of unknowns. I wasn't sure if it was the beer talking, but I could feel the tension building up inside me. There was something about the woods that didn't sit right anymore. I caught Liam staring at the window, his little face pale in the dim light. He didn't speak much during dinner, just picked at his food and kept glancing out into the growing darkness. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like it out there," he said, his small voice trembling. My heart sank. If Liam, the youngest of us, could feel it, then maybe I wasn't just imagining things. I glanced at my dad, hoping to see some reassurance, but he was busy pouring himself another drink. I turned back to Liam, forcing a smile. "It's okay, man," I said, my voice trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're just camping. It's gonna be fun." But my words felt hollow even to me. After dinner, our dads decided to head into the woods to start the fire. We followed them, leaving the warmth of the house behind. The air outside was cooler now, and the woods felt even darker, more suffocating. The trees stood like towering sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The crunch of our boots on the forest floor felt too loud, almost unnatural, as if we were disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. The tension between us was palpable. Ethan and Ryan were trying to act like it was just another fun adventure, but I could see the flickers of doubt in their eyes too. We were all starting to feel it now. The weight of the forest. The feeling that something was watching us, just beyond the edges of our sight. We reached the campsite and our dads went to work on setting up the fire pit. They made jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but there was a nervous energy in the air. Even Liam, who had been excited earlier, was quiet now. He clutched his sleeping bag to his chest, his eyes constantly scanning the woods around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the fire flickered to life, casting shadows that danced and twisted in the darkness, I stared into the flames, trying to focus on something other than the gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, but the sound of it didn't feel comforting. Felt wrong. Too sharp. Too cold. Ethan sat next to me, his face drawn, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. "Do you think it's safe out here?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I swallowed, unsure of what to say. "It's fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "We're fine." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't believe them. Ryan, who had been silent for a while, suddenly stood up and started pacing around the campsite. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "I swear, I heard something moving in the woods." Liam's eyes widened, and he grabbed onto my arm. "What was that?" His voice was barely audible, but it had a tone of absolute terror in it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but then I heard it too. A rustling sound, just beyond the firelight. It wasn't the normal sounds of the forest. This was deliberate, heavy, like something was moving towards us, slowly, carefully. My heart started to race. I looked at my dad, but he didn't seem to notice anything. Uncle Kevin was still by the fire, chatting loudly, completely oblivious to the growing tension. I turned back to the dark trees, my breath coming faster now. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. No one answered, but the sound was unmistakable. It was closer now, too close. Suddenly, Liam screamed, his voice high-pitched and full of fear. "There's something out there." My dad turned around, startled. But before anyone could react, the rustling in the trees stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were alive with something more than just the usual creatures of the night. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching, it was waiting, watching us, and it wasn't about to let us leave easily.